Welcome to the Brussels studio. My name is Laura Khazanov and I am joined today by Regina Doherty, member of the European Parliament for the European People's Party. She's here to talk to me about the outlook for the Irish presidency. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, pleasure.
Right, let's start off with the top newsline of the day. Today, Kaja Kallas and senior EU officials are headed to Ankara. They're in Ankara, Turkey right now, and Turkey hopes that Ireland's presidency could reset EU-Turkey relations. They've been in a sort of deadlock for the past 6 months under the Cypriot presidency. Do you feel like Ireland will try to reset that relationship?
I think when I look at the priorities, and just at the outset to say that we obviously take over the presidency tomorrow, not only is it a huge responsibility, but it's an enormous privilege. It's 13 years since we last managed this particular privilege. I think when I look at our objectives, competitiveness is something that's highly on the agenda, not just for us, but for everybody. Defence and security is a very, very top priority. But for us, the third priority that we've chosen is our values. And the values is not only to extend and enlarge the EU relationship and community, but also to the relationships that we have with potential third countries. We're in a flux period with Turkey, particularly over the last 6 months. As I said, nothing has happened. I think one of our objectives will be to try and move the dial and to make sure that we're in a different place with relationships. But it's notwithstanding, obviously, the difficulties that still exist need to be managed and progressed. And I think that's true not just of the relationship with Turkey, but you can see from the relationship and difficulties that we have with China, the meeting with the Commissioner yesterday, we need to start advancing all of the areas that affect Europe's competitiveness, which is the top priority of the agenda of, I think, every country, but it definitely will be Ireland's top priority in the next 6 months.
Yes, as you mentioned, and Europe is increasingly talking about economic security, competitiveness, reducing that dependency on China. How much tougher should the EU be on Beijing? What concrete progress do you see emerging from the Irish presidency?
So I think, first of all, the reality is that it's very unbalanced. And that's not just because we've been so intent of creating agendas that necessarily our businesses weren't able to take advantage of over the last number of years. I think a lot of the things that we didn't do have resulted in the position that we're in. And I think being reflective on what we can actually control is probably a priority at the moment. Now, notwithstanding, obviously, we're trying to have better relationships and rebalance, the international trade that does exist, because we're very large trading partners, but it's just very, very imbalanced. China obviously has enormous state-aided environments, opportunities that have taken advantage of European businesses. We need to make sure that we rebalance the relationship, and by doing that, we need to make Europe more competitive. And I think that means unravelling a lot of the bureaucracy that we've put on businesses over the last number of years, but also recognising that if we don't give our own businesses those opportunities to take advantage of the new world order, the AI, the electronics, the climate change, carbon targets that we've given, and the back of advantages of businesses for those, which we didn't do for the last 5 or 10 years, a lot of what we can control to change and make Europe more competitive is within our own gift. Whilst at the same time, obviously, we definitely have to manage those not just emerging threats, but existing threats, and try and have better relationships with us. And I think how we do that is having free, open trade relationships with as much of the world as we can, but recognising the threat that obviously China does pose to European businesses and reacting appropriately.
You spoke of exactly international trade and business, and Ireland hosts the headquarters of Google, Microsoft, Apple, all of these massive technological conglomerates, and you've also appointed a former Meta lobbyist to lead Ireland's Data Protection Commission. This has caused quite a stir, since Ireland will now be chairing negotiations on AI. They will be chairing negotiations on digital regulation. How would you say, isn't there a slight conflict of interest here?
I don't think so. So first of all, I'll tell you that we have 3 data protection commissioners and she's only one, and she's very esteemed, proficient and very, very good at what she has done previously, and I think she's actually will be well suited to the role because she gets to see both sides of the fence. And I think we also have to recognise that when people take on new roles, they don't bring carryover of where they, the previous position that they might be in. And I've met her, and the committee that I'm sitting on has brought them before the committee, and I think I'd be very confident that they will act imbalanced, impartially, and in the best interest, obviously, of the citizens, which is the entire citizenship of the EU. The second thing I will say about Ireland, the last time we held the presidency was in 2013. The world, and indeed Ireland, was in a very, very different place today, back then, than it is today. We had just come through a financial crash. We had received enormous help, obviously, from European partners and from the IMF. We were very, very keen to rebuild and repay the relationship and the goodwill that we had received. And I think we very much acted as an honest broker. The last time we were there, we also negotiated the MFF, which was about 960 billion euros. We will do exactly the same during the next 6 months. We will act as an honest broker, regardless of the file, without fear or favour, and act in the interest of the 450 million people. Yes, we have been blessed to have some very large international, both data agencies, but also pharmaceutical companies that have chosen to make their headquarters in Ireland. And obviously our economy has benefited from that. And there is an element of the Irish government's job is to protect and foster that environment in Ireland, to keep those businesses in situ for the jobs that they produce, but also to encourage new people and new businesses internationally, not just American, to come to Ireland. But whatever file we sit at, whatever table and meeting we chair over the next 6 months, we will do it in the best interests of the 450 million citizens that the presidency represent, and not just the 5 million that comes from Ireland. And I think our track record has shown that. I think all eyes will be on Ireland for the next 6 months to ensure, but I can absolutely guarantee you that there's nothing to fear, that we will act in the best interests of the entire bloc for the next 6 months and not any individual state.
Now, an issue that sits very close to the hearts of anyone on the eastern flank, of course, defence and security of our European continent. Ireland remains largely militarily neutral. You're not part of NATO. You span among the lowest shares of GDP on defence in Europe. Yet your presidency has said that they will put defence at the top of the agenda. Now, there is a concern. Can a neutral country credibly lead Europe's rearmament?
So I think the first thing we need to talk about is that the centre of everything that we do in Europe is to protect the peace that we enjoy, notwithstanding, obviously, that we have a war on our continent in Ukraine, an illegal war that was waged by Russia. But every single thing we do, every euro we spend, every decision we make, has to be in the interest of protecting peace. And I can genuinely and honestly tell you, and we're not mainly militarily neutral, we're entirely militarily neutral. But what we are not is politically neutral. And so we know exactly when to come down on which side, and it always has to be the right side. We have to do, and particularly in Ireland, an awful lot more and spend an awful lot more to protect the peace that most of us enjoy. Many Europeans have never, ever experienced, thankfully, any kind of conflict. But what we can all see in real time on our phones and on our TV screens, the absolute onslaught that our Ukrainian colleagues are taking and our Ukrainian neighbours are taking. Everything we do has to be centred around what we spend, what decisions we make to protect the peace. And in your part of the world, those decisions might be different to what we decide to do in my part of the world. What's very obvious to me, and I can see the change of the conversation in Irish politics and even of Irish people who very much value and protect our military neutrality, is that that conversation has changed. The realisation that we do live in a world, I think there was a view, particularly in Ireland, that we live miles away from anywhere. We are in the lucky position of nobody's ever going to get off a boat, and attack Ireland. And I think that kind of frame of thinking was very much our reality. It's not until you frame the conversation about what happens when something happens in another part of Europe that actually directly impacts you. We have a wonderful community of Ukrainians living with us for the last number of years. They shouldn't be there. They're very, very welcome. But we see the impact of what's going on in Ukraine, and now all of a sudden it doesn't feel so very far away. You also look at the infrastructure that we have around Ireland, our cables. We don't actually have the capability of actually protecting ourselves at the moment. And then you make kind of that realisation that actually this is our entire economy is dependent on some of this infrastructure, and yet we can't even defend it ourselves. So the conversation has been framed very differently in the last number of years, and I think people's mindsets have changed. And so whereas even a couple of years ago, we might have been fraught at thinking, oh my God, spending money on physical infrastructure to protect the borders of Europe might have been abhorrent to us. Today, that's not quite the case anymore. I think the realisation of what we need to do, not just as a country, but as a bloc, to protect our peace has become a real, genuine talking conversation.
Now, you speak on Ukraine, and of course, European allies are spending billions on support for Ukraine. Ireland's presidency has also claimed that it will put that support at the centre of its agenda. Yet, I have to ask you about this. Irish businesses continue exporting alumina directly to Russia. How does one justify Ireland's continuous profit from Russia's economy?
So first of all, the investigation is incomplete. And I think I was probably one of the first Irish MEPs, maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago at this stage, to say if it became clear with evidence that that's exactly what we were doing, well, then it absolutely wouldn't be acceptable and it would be immoral. That investigation isn't complete. And actually, I think we'll do the if and when. If it is found that that's something that's happening, well, then I think we would have no choice but to close the plant immediately. And I think when we look at sanctions, and it wasn't included in the last package of sanctions, it's under, obviously, consideration. I heard from the Commissioner that she trusts, obviously, the bona fides of the investigation that's going on within Ireland. But if it does transpire that that's exactly what's happening, well, then you don't have any choice, because you don't have a moral capacity to say that you stand square behind Ukraine on one hand and then actually participate in, the production of potentially military equipment that's destroying lives. You can't say both and have any bona fides. And so what we need to do is we need some speed. And actually, genuinely, there's a frustration that that speed isn't apparent. We need speed in the results of that investigation. And if it turns out that we are, well, then it needs to be ceased immediately without question.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for tuning in. This was Laura Hazanov at the Brussels studio for TVP World.